Pastcast Channel's Episode 2, The Viking Siege of France, The Silent Storm of the North. Who were the Vikings? Cold wind glides across the foaming waters of the northern seas. Before the waves crash ashore, they seem to pause, as if even nature holds its breath in the face of what is approaching. In the distance, a sail slowly emerges from the mist. Upon it, a blood-red dragon. And then, the storm begins. But this storm does not come with wind, it comes with an axe. The Vikings, not just seaborne raiders, but burned into the memory of an entire age as invaders, explorers, traders, warriors, and even mythological threats. But who were these people really? The foundations of a people. Where did the Vikings come from? The word Viking comes from the Old Norse term Vikingur, meaning expedition or to go on a raid. They emerged from the harsh lands of Scandinavia, present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries. In these rugged northern landscapes, survival was a daily struggle. The soil was poor, the winters long and cruel. These conditions forged a people who were both resilient and fearless, and pushed them to seek fortune beyond their shores. Culture, honor, courage, and bloodthirsty gods. In Viking society, life was inseparable from war and the gods. Odin, the god of wisdom and battle. Thor, the thunderer who crushed giants to keep order. And Valhalla, a hall of eternal glory, only reached through an honorable death in combat. To fight was not only a way to live, but a way to die with meaning. Vikings showed no mercy in battle, because they believed behind each strike stood a promise made to their gods. Viking ship technology, masters of the sea. The secret weapon behind the unstoppable Viking raids wasn't just brute strength, it was their revolutionary longships. These vessels were sleek enough for oceans and narrow enough for rivers, built to land almost anywhere, even directly onto beaches, capable of carrying over 50 warriors at a time. Thanks to these ships, Vikings reached as far as England, Byzantium, Iceland, and even North Africa. They conquered with both their swords and their craftsmanship. Everyday life and social structure. Not every Viking was a warrior. In fact, most were farmers, artisans, and traders. Women held significant power. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and manage households. Vikings were also master metalworkers, shipbuilders, and textile producers. Through trade, they connected Europe to silk from the Arab world, furs from Slavic lands, and countless other goods via complex trade routes. They were not only raiders, they were cultural bridges. Were they just savages? Numbered for centuries, Vikings were portrayed as barbarian invaders. But that's the legacy of Eurocentric history. In reality, they helped lay the foundations of Russia. Rurik dynasty controlled York in England, founded a lasting dynasty in Normandy, served as elite guards in the Byzantine Empire, Varangian Guard, and were documented by Arab travelers like Ibn Fadlan in vivid detail. They didn't just destroy, they built, traded, and governed. A storm begins in silence. One of history's deepest imprints comes not from sudden invasions, but from the kind of threat that grows slowly and strikes precisely. That's what the Vikings were, a storm that brewed in silence and hit with fury. And as their ships approached the Seine River, Paris had no idea what was coming. Would you like me to continue translating the rest of the series into English too? Tension in the Frankish lands. What was the state of France? Paris lay asleep on the banks of the Seine, its stone walls silent. But beyond those walls, history had already begun to crack, because Rome had fallen long ago, and the West had not yet found a new order. After Charlemagne, a fragmented empire. By the end of the 8th century, much of Europe was under the rule of Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor. But after his death, the great empire was divided among his 3 sons. This division not only split the land, it shattered authority, order, and security. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun split the empire into 3. West Francia, the foundation of modern France; East Francia, precursor to the Holy Roman Empire; and Middle Francia, including modern Italy, Lotharingia, and Burgundy. This political fragmentation opened a wide door for the Vikings. Weak kings, unprotected people. The newly crowned king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, was nowhere near as powerful as Charlemagne. His military forces were limited. There was no central army. And the nobility often ignored the king's commands, favoring their own interests instead. When a Viking fleet landed on the shore, the people were helpless. The kingdom couldn't respond fast enough. Towns and cities were often left to fend for themselves. The defenses of medieval cities, crumbling walls, fragile fortresses. The cities of this era were often still surrounded by ancient Roman walls, but those walls were old, damaged, and inadequate against Viking tactics. The Frankish kingdoms had not yet developed new, advanced fortifications. In Paris, defense fell to local lords and church leaders, who organized militias of volunteers to guard the city. But these militias were poorly trained, badly equipped, and quickly demoralized by the fearsome reputation of the Norse raiders. Wealth amid chaos. Why France was an attractive target. For the Vikings, West Francia wasn't just weak, it was also rich. Monasteries were full of gold, silver, and holy relics. Civilians were usually unarmed, exhausted from taxation, and increasingly skeptical of the king's ability to protect them. This created the perfect equation. Low resistance, high reward. Thanks to the navigability of the Seine, Viking ships could raid not just coastal villages, but the very heart of France. Paris became one of the most tempting targets of all. The spirit of the times, from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. The instability in France was part of a broader European transition. After Rome's collapse, the continent was still in search of a new identity and order. Christianity was spreading, but the church's authority varied by region. People were caught in a swirl of shifting loyalties, from empire to kingdom, from kingdom to fragmented fiefdom. This chaos explains why Viking raids proved so effective and devastating. Conclusion: when the Vikings came, France was not ready. Charles the Bald understood the threat, but there was little he could do. His army was limited, his nobles disobedient, and his people living in fear. When the Viking fleet approached the walls of Paris, it was more than just a military challenge. It was a reckoning for a crumbling order. And the reckoning had already begun. 845. The river to Paris. The Seine was quiet that morning. Mist danced slowly over the water, cloaking the city in an invisible veil. Fishermen moored their boats, and prayers rose from the cathedral. But the sound echoing from upstream was not a hymn, it was the rhythm of oars. That day, Paris would face a trial carved into the heart of history. The Vikings, come by river, the strategic importance of the Seine. To reach the heart of France, the sea alone was not enough. The Vikings knew this. That's why they targeted Europe's arteries, its rivers. And the Seine was the shortest, most open path to Paris. In 845, a massive Viking fleet of around 120 ships entered the Seine from the North Sea. This wasn't just a large raid, it was a focused and deliberate attack aimed at the heart of Paris itself. Ragnar Lodbrok, myth or man. The man said to have led this assault was a Viking chieftain named Ragnar Lodbrok. His name appears in Norse sagas, poems, and folklore. But did Ragnar truly exist? In Norse mythology, Ragnar Lodbrok is a legendary warrior descended from Odin, a dragon slayer, a conqueror of Paris, and a hero who meets his end in a pit of snakes. Historical records do not directly name Ragnar as the commander of the 845 attack. However, many scholars believe the events of this siege inspired the Ragnar legend. So, the Siege of Paris is not just a historical moment, it's also the birthplace of myth. The siege begins. Paris trembles. As the Viking fleet advanced, Frankish villages along the river were burned and pillaged. Monasteries were looted, priests were killed, civilians slaughtered. It was not only a physical assault, it was a psychological war on the Frankish people. When the fleet reached Paris, the city had scrambled to prepare defenses. But the walls were old, the garrison weak, and the soldiers inexperienced. King Charles the Bald sent part of his army along the Seine to intercept the invaders. The Vikings defeated them with ease and laid siege to the city. Victory bought in silver. One of history's largest ransoms, the people of Paris were desperate. As the Viking battering rams struck the gates, prayers and panic filled the air inside the city. Before the city fell, Charles made a critical decision. He would negotiate. At the end of the siege in 845, the Viking army was paid a ransom of 7,000 livres of silver to withdraw. This sum was extraordinary for the time and is considered one of the largest ransoms ever recorded. The Vikings accepted the payment and departed. But what they left behind was more than ruins. They left a scar in the memory of a people. A bloodless victory, strategic genius, or humiliation. The Vikings did not destroy Paris, but they made an impact as profound as any conquering army. This event triggered paranoia among the Franks, shook the legitimacy of the king, and showed that Europe's defenses were painfully unprepared for northern threats. The siege didn't just challenge a city, it undermined the very idea of royal protection. The legend is born, and Europe trembles. After the siege, the name Ragnar Lodbrok began to echo across Europe. In church records, sermons, and songs, a man from the river, slithering like a serpent, mighty like the gods. The siege of Paris in 845 was more than a military campaign. It was the first thunderclap of a Norse storm that would sweep across the continent, and its echoes still rumble today. The cost of silver resistance and negotiation. Paris did not fall. Its walls were not breached, its towers not torn down, its cathedral not looted. Yet the city was still defeated. Because some victories are not won with swords, but bought with silver. In 845, the Vikings reached the gates of Paris, and the king chose not to fight, but to survive by making a deal. Charles the Bald, a king cornered, the king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, was young and inexperienced. He had inherited the remnants of Charlemagne's empire, but all that remained was its shadow. When Viking ships began sailing up the Seine, Charles tried to gather his forces. But his army was small. There was no standing military, and the nobility acted independently, often ignoring royal orders. The king faced a grim choice: lose the city and his crown, or strike a deal and buy time. Terms of the deal: silence for silver. Charles agreed to pay. The Viking leader presumed by some to be Ragnar Lodbrok, a ransom of 7,000 livres of silver. This wasn't just a vast fortune, it was an economic shock to the entire kingdom. The deal allowed the Vikings to leave without resistance, bought the Franks some peace, but at the cost of honor and fear. Charles had spared his capital, but in doing so, he undermined his authority and exposed the vulnerability of his realm. Strategic retreat or historical weakness. This kind of ransom payment, later known as Danegeld in England, would become a common tactic across Europe in the coming decades. But the logic was simple and dangerous. If you pay once, you'll pay again. The Vikings realized that kingdoms were willing to trade wealth for survival. From then on, many raids were launched not to conquer, but to negotiate. Political and psychological fallout. This agreement, though it saved Paris, created long-lasting damage. The king's legitimacy was weakened. The people lost trust in royal protection, and Viking power across Europe grew stronger. The church interpreted the siege as divine punishment. The people were sinful, and God sent the enemy upon them. This message created an atmosphere of guilt, fear, and penance throughout the kingdom. From raiders to diplomats, a new Viking strategy. For the Vikings, this was not just a raid, it was a prestige victory. The ransom proved they could win without bloodshed, bend kings to their will, and gain riches without risking their lives. Ragnar, or whoever led the siege, became a legendary figure, a man who conquered a city without laying it to waste. This type of psychological warfare marked a turning point in Viking tactics. They were now powerful negotiators, not just raiders. Silver is paid, but honor is lost. The city survived, but Europe would never again sleep peacefully. Because the enemy was not just strong, it was smart, flexible, and fully aware of the weakness of the crowns it challenged. The siege of Paris in 845 was more than a military event. It was the moment the Franks realized that the old world order was crumbling. History or myth? The shadow of Ragnar Lodbrok. A name whispered through the winds of the north for centuries. Ragnar Lodbrok. To some, he was a legendary hero. To others, a real Viking warlord. But what is the truth? Ragnar Lodbrok. The birth of a legend. In Norse sagas, poems, and folklore, Ragnar Lodbrok is portrayed as a warrior of noble blood, a man who fought giants, spoke with the gods, and carried a dragon-embellished banner. He became one of the most feared and respected leaders in the collective memory of the North. According to legend, he was a descendant of Odin, slayed dragons, raided Paris, and met his end in a pit of serpents thrown by a Northumbrian king. But where does the myth end and the truth begin? Ragnar in historical records. When we look at actual historical sources, things become far more complicated. Frankish annals and Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention Viking raids, but rarely, if ever, do they mention Ragnar Lodbrok by name. This has led many historians to believe that Ragnar was not a single real person, but rather a composite figure, blending the deeds of multiple Viking leaders, such as Ragnar, the leader of the 845 siege of Paris, Ragnar of Northumbria, and possibly others like Sigurd Snake in the Eye, the son of Ragnar in sagas. In this way, legend and history blur into one another. The siege of Paris, Ragnar's most famous exploit. In the sagas, Ragnar's most defining moment is the siege of Paris in 845. He leads a massive fleet up the Seine, storms the city, and demands a ransom. After taking the silver, he departs in triumph. This story is rooted in truth. The siege of Paris did happen, and a massive ransom was paid. Was the leader actually Ragnar? We may never know for sure. But that ambiguity is precisely what allowed the myth to flourish. A bridge between legend and reality. The figure of Ragnar Lodbrok stands at the crossroads between history and storytelling. Even if no single man performed all the deeds attributed to him, Ragnar represents the courage, ambition, and fearsome nature of the Viking Age itself. He became a symbol, a name that survived through oral tradition and evolved into an archetype. We see this pattern often in history. A real or imagined figure becomes the vessel for collective memory and meaning. Ragnar in pop culture. From saga to screen today, Ragnar Lodbrok lives on in films, TV shows, video games, and novels. The most well-known modern portrayal is in the TV series Vikings, where Ragnar is shown not only as a warrior, but also a father, philosopher, and dreamer. These modern interpretations reimagine him for new audiences, explore his internal conflicts, and blend historical fragments with creative narrative. Ragnar has become a lens through which we explore Viking values, identity, and legacy. So, what was he, really? Was Ragnar Lodbrok a real Viking warlord who led fleets across Europe? A literary hero stitched together from the legends of many men? Or simply a myth born of fire, blood, and storytelling? The answer may be all three. Because history is not just about what happened, but also about what people believed happened. And in that belief, Ragnar Lodbrok never stopped sailing. Even today, his shadow still drifts across the rivers of Europe, silent, ominous, and unforgettable. A fire in memory. The siege in myth and popular culture. The Siege of Paris in 845 was not just a historical event. It became a myth etched into the memory of Europe. An event that outgrew its time, turning into legend, song, and symbol. It was a fire that never went out. The birth of legends and the rise of Ragnar. At the center of this legendary flame stands a name, Ragnar Lodbrok. According to Norse sagas, Ragnar was more than a warrior. He was a dragon slayer, a descendant of Odin, a hero who raided Paris and defied kings. Whether or not Ragnar truly existed is still debated. But what matters is what he came to represent. The archetypal Viking, fearless, cunning, and destined to challenge the great empires of the South. These stories became part of an oral tradition, passed from one generation to another, blurring the line between history and myth. Modern media and the rebirth of the Viking centuries. After the Viking Age ended, a cultural revival began. Modern media rediscovered the Norsemen and reimagined them. TV shows like Vikings portrayed Ragnar Lodbrok as a complex anti-hero, both ruthless and philosophical. Video games such as Assassin's Creed, Valhalla allowed players to live the Viking experience, raid by raid. Films, novels, comics, and even fashion began to borrow from Viking symbols, runes, and aesthetics. The Viking became an icon of resistance, identity, and primal strength. And at the heart of that image stood the memory of events like the Siege of Paris. Cultural legacy, from memory to meaning. In French cultural memory, the 845 siege became more than just an attack. It was a story of survival, of defeat without collapse, and of the realization that even mighty cities are vulnerable. It inspired historical novels, appeared in medieval chronicles, and left a mark on national narratives about identity and invasion. For the Franks, the Vikings were not just invaders. They were omens, sent perhaps as punishment, perhaps as prophecy. The Church often interpreted the siege as a divine warning, a message to return to faith and order. The power of story, between fact and faith. Historical memory is not built on facts alone. It is shaped by what people choose to remember, how they tell it, and how they pass it on. The story of the Siege of Paris, whether viewed as history or legend, offers a mirror for all generations. How do we respond to fear? What do we sacrifice for survival? And who gets remembered, the conqueror or the city that endured? A fire that never went out. The ships eventually left. The silver was spent, but the story remained. It burned in the hearts of poets, monks, warriors, and now screenwriters. It was a tale carried across oceans and centuries. Because some events do not end when the swords are sheathed. Some burn forever as a fire in memory. After the siege, how Europe changed the Siege of Paris in 845 was not just the story of one city, one army, or one moment. It was a rupture, a shift that would ripple across a continent. The Viking storm had arrived, and Europe would never be the same again. The evolution of defense, feudal castles and new fortifications, and of the most immediate effects of the siege was a complete transformation in defense strategies. The aging Roman walls that once protected European cities had proven ineffective. In the decades following the Viking assault, feudal castles began to rise across the landscape. These fortresses were not just military structures, but also centers of local power. Thick stone walls, watchtowers, and fortified gates became standard. River crossings and trade routes were secured with new vigilance. Local lords took it upon themselves to defend their territories, thus laying the groundwork for the feudal order. The spread of Danegeld, paying off the Vikings. The 7,000 livres of silver paid to the Vikings at Paris marked the beginning of a dangerous precedent. From this point onward, many European rulers resorted to paying Danegeld a ransom or tribute paid to Viking raiders to avoid destruction. This policy temporarily bought peace, but emboldened the Vikings and drained state treasuries. If it worked once, it will work again, became the logic of the raiders. The Vikings began to target not just poorly defended villages, but wealthy regions where gold could be traded for mercy. Vikings as political players in Europe. The siege of Paris transformed the image of the Viking from a mere raider to a geopolitical actor. In the years that followed, they founded the Danelaw in England, settled in Normandy, which literally means land of the Northmen, participated in the founding of Kievan Rus, and served as elite mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire's Varangian Guard. From the ashes of raids rose new kingdoms, dynasties, and alliances. The Vikings were no longer on the outside of history, they were writing it. Religious transformation and the rise of the church. The trauma of the siege had spiritual consequences as well. Monasteries were raided, relics stolen, and churches burned. But this did not diminish Christianity, it strengthened it. In response to the fear and chaos, the church positioned itself as the protector of the people. New monasteries were built with stronger walls and political backing. Christian kings were pressured to defend Christendom more fiercely, and many Vikings themselves eventually converted to Christianity, integrating into local cultures. Faith became not only a spiritual force, but a political one. The birth of feudalism, from chaos to control. The Viking threat accelerated a broader transition already underway. The centralized authority of the Carolingians was crumbling, and local leaders began to fill the void. In this fragmented political climate, land was exchanged for loyalty, power was localized, and knights and lords emerged as defenders of their own territories. This shift marked the formal birth of feudalism, a system that would define Europe for the next several centuries. In summary, a siege that redefined a continent. The siege of Paris was not just a battle. It was a trigger for military innovation, for political transformation, and for the psychological reshaping of an entire continent. After 845, Europe began to speak a different language, a language of fortresses, fealty, and silver. A world defined not by the legacies of Rome, but by the realities of Viking Age power. The storm had come, and the map of Europe would never look the same again.